Kovshovik.
Yes.
All right, I'll turn it over to you then. Take it
Okay.
away.
I'm going to be sitting for this presentation because the bigger part of it is going to be practical. I'm actually going to deploy everything on DigitalOcean. We'll configure the Kubernetes cluster. We'll set up Rancher. We'll build a Docker image. We'll push it up. We'll deploy it. We'll set up SSL. So I need to be sitting for this. And so this is the typical life cycle of how we build the web applications. So Elixir developer gets excited and decides to write some code to build an application. They build a beautiful web application using Nginx, functional programming language. Their code is nice, the contexts are well separated, everything's beautiful. Then they need to deploy it, bring it to the world. And now at this point, you need to decide, am I going to deploy to the cloud? Am I going to go with a VPS, virtual private servers, or some platform as a service? How do I deal with scalability if I'm building a next social network? Or like, how do I deploy it? There's so many choices, and there doesn't seem to be a consensus of how you do this. Do I deploy everything in Docker? It's a new buzzword and / technology everybody seems to be using, seems to like. There's a new kid in the block, relatively new. It's Kubernetes. Everybody deploys on Kubernetes, but when you pop up the documentation, you're shocked. How many things you need to understand to even get it to run? How do I configure my cluster? Like, do I deploy on Amazon and use their EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service, or Google platform, or Microsoft? How do I do this? How do I figure out the SSL? Do I buy a certificate from GoDaddy? Nobody does that anymore. Everybody uses Let's Encrypt because it's free. Even the companies, like, except for if you're a bank, if you want to have this like company LLC in the address bar, then you would go buy a certificate from somebody like DigiCert. But if you're like me, you're cheap. And if I'm cheap, I would go to Let's Encrypt. Like, how do I make sure of high availability and durability of my application and easy scalability? So there's many questions you have to answer before you can change the world, or impress your girlfriend or boyfriend, or achieve financial freedom and find a dream job, right? So in this audience, how many of you run Elixir code in production? That's like 5 people. It's pretty cool. How many of you run in Docker containers? That's same. So everybody runs Elixir code in Docker containers. How many of you use container orchestration, any kind? It's Kubernetes.
Yeah.
So it's two people. And how many of you consider everything easy and straightforward? It's not, but there's a way. There is a relatively easy way to do this. There's software built, it's open source, it's free. There's a company that's called Rancher Labs. They built a software that would configure the Kubernetes cluster for you, that would let you deploy the applications using your mouse rather than writing those config files in YAML. It's pretty scary when you're just beginning, but I found this works great for me. I deploy my personal blog, which doesn't have much in it yet. I have my sort of gigs side business, vindeals.ca. It's a Rails application, but it's also deployed in Rancher. I deployed his blog in that same cluster. Yes, so it works. I mean, I have incredible uptime. I don't have one user or two, so works quite well. So this is the tools that we're going to use. We're going to start with a pretty simple Phoenix application that's built in Elixir language that compiles into Beam. Then we're going to use the distillery made by this person, Paul Schoenfelder. I'm sure I butchered his name. He built a tool called Distillery. A distillery packages up your application, a compiled version of your application with everything that it needs to run in a nice, neat tarball, which you can then either ship off to some server, run it, please.
In the intro, sorry.
Okay.
Actually, at the end, go ahead when you finish. I just have one little note to make about distillery.
Oh, of course. Or you could just use it as an executable, deploy it on some server, just run it manually, or include it in your Docker image, or whatever you want to do. So that's.
Does that include the runtime and everything you need?
Yes, there is an option. That's optional. You can decide to include the ERTS, Erlang Runtime System. Yeah. What was the note?
I don't know. Last I checked, they were working on actually building something heavily inspired by distillery into Mix.
Well,
So that you can just do like Mix, I can't remember if it was Mix deploy, Mix build, Mix, something like that. And you can basically just have it build that tower level for you.
Yeah, that's interesting because distillery was sort of inspired by EXRM. That's the tool that was popular before distillery, and now distillery is mentioned in Phoenix documentation as a go-to release management system. I know that Paul, last time at the conference, he was talking about dedicating more time on documenting distillery, and I think he did because they released the version 2.0 of it, and the documentation is now cleaned up and much better. Last time I used it, it was version 1 something, and I had to get around some kinks, and I was receiving some crazy error messages, which no human should understand, right? I just simply copied the whole page into Google. All right, it's a pretty cool tool.
sorry, question.
Yeah, sure.
So what would you need on a system that you deployed that entire bundle to? Would you need
It depends.
Erlang or?
It depends. If you decide to include the Erlang in the release, then you just need nothing, just Linux, pretty much, right? As long as it's the same architecture as the compiler.
What we ran into is the OpenSSL. So we use Alpine Linux for our Docker, which basically has nothing, right? So we basically install Bash, and then we install OpenSSL. Anything else?
Yeah, it's like only if your app needs other things. Like, we might call out to some PDF libraries, so we'll need those. But like, other than that, like, it's just the Erlang runtime is compiled in, and yes, you don't need anything else. It's just the Linux.
Image, like 24 minutes.
Yeah, and I think you can include arbitrary files in the distillery release as well. Like you can include the source code. By default, it's not included, but you can for migrations and such, for example.
Nice.
Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a tool, is a framework built by Google, and I think they use it internally to deploy their own stuff. They open sourced it. It's from their website. The definition is it's open source system for automating deployment, scaling, and management of containerized applications. Does that help understand what it is? It didn't help me. So I watched a bunch of videos. I watched a course on Lynda, and I followed along. And still, I wasn't. After many days working with Kubernetes, after I started, I wasn't comfortable with it at all. Like it's nicely engineered. It's probably made for huge scale, made for enterprise, for a person maybe people, a team dedicated to just configuring and running Kubernetes, not for one like developer deploying their blog or a website. But you can still use Kubernetes for your personal things. So this is where Rancher comes in. Rancher is an open source software for delivering Kubernetes as a service. Rancher will configure the Kubernetes cluster for you. It provides you with a nice UI for deploying applications, for configuring Ingress, like Nginx. I'm going to talk about this as I do the practical demo, but Rancher is really nice. It's a much better web UI for Kubernetes. So the plan is we're going to start with I wrote a simple Phoenix application. I just generated a new Phoenix application. I created a simple page in it that just simply lists some records from the database, some books with authors. I'm going to run it locally first to show you how it looks, and then we're going to write a Docker file for it we're going to stand up new Rancher instance on DigitalOcean. We're going to have Rancher configure the Kubernetes cluster. We're going to configure this simple Phoenix application with Distillery for releases. We're going to make some changes in the Phoenix configuration for production to take the database connection options from environment. And we're going to deploy this application on the Kubernetes cluster, and then we're going to add SSL to it using the Let's Encrypt, which would automatically renew for you. It's fully automated, so that's the plan. When I tested this last, it took me about 35-40 minutes, but since I'm doing it the second time, should be even shorter than that. Okay, so let's do it. First thing I want to do, I want to configure the Rancher and start the Kubernetes cluster configuration, because it takes a few minutes. While Rancher does that, I'm going to configure the application. So DigitalOcean, going to log in. By the way, does anybody use DigitalOcean here for anything? Everybody. Perfect, that's great. So you are familiar with this UI. It's nothing crazy here. So I'm just going to create the droplet. Might get a little bigger. And I'm going to just use the default. Actually, you know what? Let's do Rancher OS. This is a lightweight image for the virtual server that just is made to run Docker. You don't have to do anything. And I'm going to use the beefier hardware to make it quicker, because I noticed when there's not enough memory, it takes just longer to do everything. But you can run everything on a smaller hardware. I'm not going to run it for a while. Just shut it down tonight, so it's not going to cost me too much. I'm going to run it in San Francisco. Just need one droplet. Let's do hostname Utah EX, and I'm going to use my SSH key. Create. While this is being created, I'll show you that application. It's a pretty basic Phoenix application. There.
Happens to anybody else, by the way.
Yep. So pretty typical. It's Phoenix 1.4 application with your models, schemas rather, with your controllers, templates, views. There's just one controller, the page controller, that has some code to load the books. Controllers, page controller. That's it. Simply just lists books. This function just loads the books from the database. So I'm just going to run it.
Could you boost the text size just a little bit?
Yeah. That's it. Just Metaprogramming in Elixir by Chris McCord. There's a couple of nice Elixir books. Just a pretty basic application. Okay, I'm gonna stop it. Host is built. Now I can deploy Rancher to it. I'm gonna copy the IP address, go to Rancher, download. I'm going to do a simple single node installation. And there's a couple of options you can go with. I would go with option D, because this option would automatically provision the SSL certificate for your Rancher host. So, but before I do that, I need to provision the domain. And DigitalOcean, I already have a couple of domains. I'm just going to create a subdomain for this Rancher. So go to networking on DigitalOcean, go to my domain, kovshovik.com, and there is Utah XIR Rancher at kovshovik.com, which points to this my test IP address. I'm just going to change it to new one. Yes, this is the new one. Save it. So it's when the domain is already registered with DigitalOcean, it takes almost no time to propagate the DNS change. So it's probably already available somewhere. So at this point, just need to copy the command, something like VI. And I'm going to use the domain name from DigitalOcean. So this is my command to install Rancher. So all I need to do is just copy it and run it on that host that I just started. Okay, so I'm SSH'd into that host, and I'm ready to run that command to run Rancher. So this is the command, straight from the Rancher documentation. Docker run. I'm running this latest version of Rancher image. I'm exposing it on ports 80 and 443. And I'm passing in an argument, the Acme domain. This would be used to provision the certificate for the Rancher host. So, okay. That's it. So far, everything good? Okay. So now I have this image running, container running, and I'm going to do docker logs. And see, this Rancher is initializing. It creates the services inside of it. It's a Java application with running some kind of application server with multiple services under it to do stuff. Run the web, run the jobs, the backend. It's doing that right now. Okay. Sounds like it's up. It is encrypted already. It's open to the world before you guys
snatch it.
Still.
Okay. Nice try, thank you.
Maybe his password's just password.
Yeah, as you can see, this is just a pretty basic web UI. It does not have anything in it, no clusters. And so to create new Kubernetes cluster, you just push a button, create cluster. And I'm going to give it a name.
Go back. I'm sorry, that was just.
Oh, sorry. Sure.
Okay, you're just going to hit cluster and new cluster.
Yeah, so by default, it just has some configuration, some things that you could configure. For example, the authentication. You could have Rancher authenticate using the Google's GitHub's OAuth, for example, or even Active Directory, I think.
To allow other administrators into the.
Yes, you can create more users or delegate the authentication to some OAuth provider.
For those who haven't used Kubernetes, could you explain briefly what a cluster is and
Great question. Of course.
all that comes with it?
Kubernetes cluster is made of a thing called control plane and your worker nodes. It's a cluster of servers and services and an API. So those services and API facilitate the container orchestration. They schedule your Docker containers to run on multiple nodes. You may have a farm of servers, and you want to, for example, you want to run 10 copies of this Docker image on all of your servers. And then basically you could tell, hey, Kubernetes, I want to run 10 copies, a replica set with 10 copies. And it will provision your containers on your services according to resources available. So it has monitoring in it and logging and a lot of things, which we're not going to concern ourselves with for now, because we're going to skip all that and not get intimidated by. But you can get into this because Rancher would also let you use Kubernetes natively using the kubectl. You could use regular kubectl after you've provisioned cluster with Rancher. Good question, thank you.
Thanks for the explanation.
All right, so the first step, create new cluster. I just push a button, add cluster, and I just give it a name. Just specify the cloud provider. So Rancher supports all of the popular providers. As you can see, it supports the Google Container Engine, Amazon EKS, Amazon EC2, Microsoft Azure, and DigitalOcean. And you could just tell it, I want 5 servers with these specs, and Rancher will create those servers for you.
Sorry, another question. So
Go ahead.
Can you run Rancher basically anywhere, and then it goes off to those providers? And
Yes.
okay. So could I run it on my own machine if I really wanted
Yes,
to?
absolutely. You
Okay.
can. It's Rancher is just a Docker container.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Yep. Okay, so just give it a name, and I'm gonna give it a node prefix. So this is how all the nodes will be named: UTAC, XIR, 1, 2, 3, etc. And I want to say, I want to create 3 nodes, and I want to give it my DigitalOcean API token.
He's recording his desktop.
Yes. And he's. Can you cover your camera? I will delete that token. So yes. Yes, I know that guy.
He's got a beefy graphics.
Okay, so this Rancher just goes out to DigitalOcean and pulls all available regions, the droplet sizes, etc. Anything you need. I'm gonna go with this type, 2 gigabytes. You can go lower. You can go with 1 gigabyte, and you can go with 1 node. It'll still work. But for the sake of this experiment, we're gonna go with 3 nodes and 2 gigabytes because it'll make it quicker to configure. I'm going to use the Rancher OS for the nodes as well. Not going to go enable backups or monitoring, anything like that, just default. And I'll give it a template name. This is the name of the template. Okay, now I need to tell it where to run the Kubernetes itself, because Kubernetes uses the etcd database to store its deployments and things, right? It's a distributed key value store, and Rancher will configure it for you. You could say you could have multiple node pools. I just have 1 node pool, and I want to run the Kubernetes stuff on all 3 of my nodes, and I can run my client applications on the same nodes if I choose to. In more sophisticated deployments, typically you would have more than 1 node pool. You would have a separate dedicated Kubernetes control plane pool that runs just the Kubernetes stuff, highly available Kubernetes stuff. And your different pools for maybe, you can even have multiple cloud providers, pools from different cloud providers if you wanted to, which is crazy, but you could do that. All right. So, okay. Now this is creating the cluster. It takes some time. It takes about 5 minutes. As soon as it's done, it'll come back. But let's take a look what else we can do. We can prepare our application to run in Docker environment. So while it does that, so first thing I need to do is I'm adding the distillery to my mix configuration. As you would normally do, is just added the mix distillery version 2.0 and run mix deps get. Okay. Second, you need to edit your prod EXS file to include your domain name for your application, because otherwise it's not going to work in Docker. I found it the hard way. This is prod EXS. This is the production configuration file. So I'm going to give it a name. This is the domain name the application is going to run under. And I want it to run on port 4000. It doesn't really matter, it's just easy this way because same port for the HTTP and the URL. This is, I guess, for the URL generators, and this is for HTTP for this Cowboy server. Then I need to run this application in Docker. And to make your Docker image sort of generic, you could run it, for example, with different secrets, with different databases on different environments. Typically, you would put the Elixir applications mix projects application configuration into config files, but I want to use environment variables and pass them into my Docker. So I'm just including the secret key base in the configuration of my endpoint, and I'm just taking the value from the secret key base. This is not how you typically use the environment variables in Elixir application. Typically, you would do this, get env, but because of the way it's evaluated, not at the runtime, but at the compile time, and your secret may not be available at the compile time, it's only available when your Docker image actually starts. There is no easy way to do this, but the distillery includes a nice little feature that's called replace OS vars. It's just like a JavaScript ES6 string replace. It'll go through all your configuration files. It'll find all of these replacements. It'll try to replace them. Yeah. One other thing you need to do, you need to change your database configuration to use environment variables as well. So I'm gonna just comment these out. It's too bad I don't have my favorite editor. It's okay, we'll make it work. There's not much code to change. So same thing, I'm just replacing the environment variables in my repo database configuration. Is everything good so far? Let me know if you lost me at any point.
Don't forget the line 65.
65. Yes. Thank you. I think you need to do, I have this line here, serve endpoints. Mark, can you clarify what that does? Do you know?
So yeah, it's basically when the release is started, we're having to tell it actually start up my endpoints so that they will actually be able to answer web requests.
Right. Oh yeah, it says this here. I forgot. So by default, when you build the release, it just doesn't start anything for you, the script. This will tell it to start endpoints. Okay, let me see if I missed anything. Serve endpoints, change domain name, database, distillery, then follow distillery install instructions. I did follow it. Actually, I'll follow it again because it needs to. I need to generate the distillery release configuration. Distillery Elixir. So installation. All I need to do is just run the mix release.init. This created a rel directory with config file in it, the release configuration. Let's go ahead and edit that file right now. This is the release configuration, the default one generated by Distillery. Thank you, Mark. Much nicer now. Okay, so default configuration for release. There is dev environment and there's production environment. We don't really need dev because we're going to run our release in production mode when we build this in Docker. So we're going to keep this. And I decided not to include the Erlang runtime because I'm going to start my Docker image from Elixir base image, which already has Elixir. So the build environment and the runtime environment are going to be exactly the same, so no need to include this in release. It'll make the release smaller. So I'm not going to need to change much else. That's pretty much it with the release. And after that, I can go ahead and build it. To save time, I'm going to skip the step building the release locally. I'm just gonna show you the Docker file for how to build the release right inside of the Docker, and I have it built already in the GitLab repo. File, Docker file. Paste this. So this is so-called dual-step build process. I have a build image with all the dependencies that are needed for the build, and I have the run image that only has minimum necessary stuff just that's needed to run the application. I'm starting my Docker image with the Elixir 1.8, and I just set a few environment variables. I want to put my app inside of the /app directory. I want to use the default. I want to use production as default mix-env. And I want to do the replacement of OS variables. I'm just specifying all these. Also, I need a node to run my application. I need node to compile SAS, and I have some SAS style sheets. So I need that. This is the standard Docker feature to specify the work directory. This is the default directory that when you run the container or shell in it, that's going to be used as a default directory. This is for caching. First, I'm just bringing my mix exs and mix log files into my Docker image. Then I fetch the dependencies and do dept compile, so that I don't have to re-get the dependencies every time I change the code. So this is everybody who uses Docker is familiar with this. Same with assets. I'm just creating the assets directory, and I'm simply adding the package.json and package.json lock JSON. And then I'm running the npm install. And then after that's done, I'm copying the rest of this. I'm copying all the files from the current directory into the current directory inside of the Docker image. So now all of my dependencies are fetched. All my source code is copied. I'm going to build the assets. There is a deploy task defined in my package.json. It just runs the webpack in production mode. Then I compile the digest. This is needed so that the Phoenix Cowboy can serve the static assets. And then finally, I run the mix release task with the environment production. This is what finally prepares the release inside of the build subdirectory. So at this point, the first image is done, and we're moving on to the next image. The next image is going to be the final image, the one that I'm going to push to my Docker repository. It also starts from exact same Elixir base image. It has exact same things, same environment variables, except for, in this case, I need, this is for debugging. I don't really need this in my final image Postgres client. I don't build anything here. I'm simply taking whatever I build in my build image, copy from build, from this directory into here. So this is my application release built in the first step. And this is a little hack which the person from Elixir Slack helped me with. Without it, you can't use the Control-C to exit out of your image of your container. This simply traps the stop command and it just forwards it, and but I use this. It works as well, just a basic entry point, but this is nicer. One other thing I need the Docker file docker ignore, so that I don't bring my cache and unnecessary stuff. That has some, some logs and some static assets that I use in development. I don't want them in my final Docker image, so I'm going to ignore them. That's it. That's all I needed. So now I'm ready to build my Docker image, and I'm going to do that. Just Docker build, and I'm going to tag it. This is my Docker Hub name, AS Pushkinus / Utah Xer latest. Okay, so a lot of the steps already have cached. This is Docker build. Okay, assembling the release, packaging the release, some output of the release. I mean, this is a little help for how you can run your release locally, but I'm not going to do this locally, so I'm just going to skip that. So image is built. I'm going to push the image out to the repository. Pushing the image.
And is this going to Docker Hub?
Yes.
Or some other repository inside Rancher?
It goes into the Docker Hub. This is it. This is the Docker Hub repo. If you check the tags, latest a few seconds ago, I just uploaded my 500 megabytes image. It is not small. You could spend some time and redo everything from Elixir Alpine and make it smaller. It's an art form. We're not going to go there today.
There is a, just so people are aware, there is like a nice Alpine Elixir ready container, and you'll end up with something like 30 megabytes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you could do that. I just I'm most familiar with the apt-get Debian, so that's the reason
This one's Debian based.
Yes. Okay, so at this point, hopefully our cluster is done, and looks like it is. So I've got my cluster. This is the cluster dashboard in Rancher. It shows me how much CPU resources and memory resources and available pods, how many available pods I have. And I'm not running anything, so my cluster is pretty much idling. Everything shows green. I've got my 3 nodes running, Elixir 1, 2, and 3. Each one of them has an IP address. Beautiful. I've got everything running. Perfect. So now I can deploy my application. This is my... Oh, before I do, I need to specify my database configuration somewhere, right? So I'm going to do... I'm going to put this in secrets. In Kubernetes, you can manage different types of resources. You can manage, you could manage deployments, load balancers, secrets, certificates, registries, lots of things, right? And so secrets is the good place to store the database connection options. Available to all namespaces. And so I'm going to methodically go over my secrets. I'm going to specify the DB host, DB name, DB user, DB password, and secret, thank you, secret keybase. Anything else I missed? Looks like that's everything that's needed. Just need the values for this now.
Denver, you got this on your camera?
Can you cover your camera? Okay. Great. So, DB host, DB name. I think I created the database already for it. Elixir prod, DB user. DB user, oh, just app, DB password, this one, and secret, very long, secret. It should be longer probably. This is for cookies and such. Okay, I created my secret. Now I'm ready to deploy the workload. Hit the deploy button, give it a name. I want to run 3 pods of my application. I have 3 servers, so I can run 3 pods or more, like depending on workload. I can start with 1 for now. I'm going to give it a name, the Docker image Elixir latest. I want to put it into default namespace. I don't really need to do any kind of port mapping at this point because I'm going to use the Ingress for it, but so that we can just see if the application is actually running, I'm going to publish the port 4000 of a container on every node. So even if a given node in a cluster doesn't run my container, every node runs a little proxy that will proxy all the requests to the service. Okay, environment variables. I'm going to use my secret. Simply just take all of the variables from that secret, and let's see what the command was. Okay, command. So I don't think I need anything else. Just click launch. There's a lot of options. You can configure most everything that Kubernetes supports. You can configure graphically right in this UI. you don't have to write any configuration files. You can download those configuration files from here though, if you wanted to later, or you can mess with the Kubernetes cluster using the kubectl if you like it.
And those changes will be reflected in the UI later,
Yes,
because it just reads from the config files anyway, right?
yes.
That's good.
So now my server is downloading that image. So I have pulling image. Hopefully it's not going to take too long. Come on. While it does that, to save time, I'm going to configure the Cert Manager. This is for SSL certificates. So I'm just going to use the built-in Let's Encrypt Cert Manager. You know how Kubernetes has this application repository. What's the name of it? Tiller? Not Tiller. Helm, yes. These are all Helm templates. So I'm simply just gonna, you can add more catalogs here. You could use the native Kubernetes catalog. It'll just download all the templates and you could launch them just like this. But there's a few built-in ones that are nice. Just simply, I'm gonna just run it. And I'm gonna use the production environment for Let's Encrypt. Launch. Okay, that's launching. And while it's launching, my application is already running. And I can see my workloads right here. So I can even click it. And if I'm lucky, it's going to pop up. So, yes. Thank you. This is not secure, and it's just an IP address that's ugly. So I'm going to go back to my networking in DigitalOcean, and I'm going to give it a domain name. I already have a record there, utaxer.shovik.com. Simply going to edit it to point to one of the servers that I already have. To do that, save it. Okay, so I pointed a domain name because we didn't configure the Ingress yet. We're going to do the Ingress. So I've got the Cert Manager configured. Load balancing. So configuring Ingress is just a button. Again, Rancher is beautiful. Just add Ingress. And I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to add Ingress for my website. In the default namespace, I'm going to specify the host name to use. That same host name, the domain name I gave there. And I'm just going to forward the path to my workload. My workload, which I previously deployed on port 4000. This is where the application is running. And I'm going to add the certificate. Use the default Ingress controller for. And for certificate to work, there is one thing I need to do. I'll show you. So I need to add this annotation. Add annotation. True. Save. And that's not it. This is one manual step that you unfortunately have to do. They promised to fix it in Rancher, later versions of Rancher. You have to edit this YAML file. This is the Ingress YAML manually. And that manual edit, I'm just going to copy this from some other. So you need to specify the secret name which would be used to store the certificates in your cluster. So right under hosts. So I'm just going to do under hosts, secret name, utaxer cert. Save. Okay, so the Cert Manager is running, the Ingress is running, the workload is running, and I've got HTTPS. I could probably open it already. Does it work?
Yep.
Is it secure?
No.
Not yet. Okay. Because it takes maybe a minute to issue the certificate. But you only have to do this once, and once you set it up, the certificates will be reissued and renewed automatically. There. Okay. It does it behind the scenes.
Secure.
There you go. So, thank you. Sorry, I have to rush at the very end because not everything went as I expected, but the goal is achieved. We deploy the application on the Docker container, and at this point, you could scale it. You could just go to your application, and you could say, "I want to run more, more," and see nodes, all these different nodes. It downloads the container and it updates your ingress. So if I created a page that is intentionally slow, for example, takes 5 seconds to run, and I would run Apache Bench on it and tested it, I could see how scaling your application improves the performance right away. So there's that. So Rancher is nice. And final little thing, how do you deploy your Elixir applications in production? Like what did you find working the best?
Yeah, so we're using Kubernetes on Amazon. We already, before moving to Kubernetes, we were already on AWS and with EC2 and everything. And so it's the easy thing for us to do was to just use Amazon EKS. So, and that's where they manage the control plane.
Mm-hmm.
And they make it multiple availability zone already. Just kind of it's kind of expensive. It's $1,000 a year, but as a business expense, that's not bad, right? And then but yeah, I wouldn't do that to play with. Yeah. But yeah, so then we create through EC2 instances, and we're creating our worker pool EC2 instances, and they just join the cluster. And then everything else, we're just using the Kubernetes dashboard for doing the visualization of what's going on with our nodes.
But it's pretty much read-only, right? Like most of it.
You can edit the YAML. You can click to edit, you can click to delete, but yeah, it's mostly read. It's not like you have a toggle to say scale, scale, scale. It's not
Right.
quite that, but it also has the ability to look at a specific pod and then get a bash shell into that pod that's running, and so
Yeah. And by the way, you could scale your application, not just the application. You could go back to your cluster, and you could edit cluster, and you could say, I want 30 nodes, or you could just add nodes here, and it'll create more servers for you. It'll register them. So $1,000 a year, that's just for the control plane. That does not include any horsepower.
Right.
So this is a cheap solution. I run all my websites on this similar setup. I recently upgraded to Rancher 2.0 on Kubernetes, and I pay roughly $50 a month to run multiple websites, the control plane and the horsepower and everything. It's a cheap solution with some maintenance. What EKS gives you is it's fully managed for you. It's like if it goes down, it probably never does, right?
Right.
This, it may go down.
But yeah, like for experimenting, learning, and doing your own personal projects, it's perfect, and it saves you a ton of money.
Yeah, and cube ctl get nodes. There. That's a regular Kubernetes
Yeah.
command line. All right, that's everything I had. Thank you.